Alistair Vance stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, looking down at the sprawling city, as if he owned every brick of it. In many ways, he did. As the chief executive of Vance Global, Alistair was ruthless, calculated, and completely out of patience. His ambitious business partner, Julian Mercer, was pacing behind him, reminding Alistair of the harsh ultimatum they had just received. The conservative investors from overseas demanded stability. They wanted a family man, not a notorious bachelor, to lead the upcoming international mega-merger. Alistair needed a respectable wife by the end of the week, or the deal of a lifetime would crumble to dust. Just as Julian began suggesting yet another superficial socialite for Alistair to marry, the heavy oak doors of the boardroom pushed open. Clara Thorne walked in, holding a heavy bucket of soapy water in one hand and a stack of highly confidential financial reports in the other, and she was completely barefoot. Her cheap grey uniform was soaked at the hems. Clara had been cleaning the adjacent executive lounge when a faulty sprinkler suddenly activated. While the junior executives had fled the room in a panic, she had rushed back in to grab the exposed merger documents left carelessly on a glass table, ruining her only pair of worn-out shoes in the process. Julian Mercer immediately started yelling, demanding to know why a cleaning lady was interrupting their private meeting. Clara did not flinch. She walked straight past the shouting man, her bare feet completely silent on the plush carpet, and dropped the perfectly dry documents onto Alistair's immaculate mahogany desk. She looked Alistair dead in the eye and told him that if his company valued billion-dollar deals, they should probably stop leaving their sensitive paperwork sitting under fire hazards. Alistair was stunned into absolute silence. Women in his world never spoke to him like that. They smiled, agreed, and carefully positioned themselves for a piece of his fortune. This woman, dripping wet and barefoot, was glaring at him with a fiery pride that caught him completely off guard. When Julian threatened to have security throw her out and fire her on the spot, Clara simply turned to the furious partner and pointed out a glaring arithmetic error on the top page of the report she had just saved. It was an error Julian himself had missed, one that would have cost them millions. The Grand Office fell into a heavy, shocked silence. Alistair dismissed Julian with a sharp wave of his hand, his dark eyes never leaving Clara. He saw an immediate opportunity. She was sharp, fearless, and undeniably entirely removed from the elite artificial circles that the foreign investors despised. Before Clara could turn to leave, Alistair locked the door and made his offer. A temporary marriage contract. 1 year of pretending to be his devoted wife in exchange for a sum of money that would change her life forever. Clara laughed, a dry and humorless sound that echoed in the large room. She told him to keep his money. She had walked away from a massive fortune once before, though she kept that dark secret buried deep. Years ago, she had renounced her corrupted, wealthy family name to live an honest, invisible life, and she valued her hard-earned independence far more than any check a billionaire could write. But Alistair did not take no for an answer. He challenged her, questioning if she was truly independent or just running from her own potential. He confessed he needed her genuine grit to survive the corporate wolves circling his company, and he offered her complete autonomy in the marriage. There would be no interference, just a business transaction between equals. Reluctantly, realizing this was a chance to finally secure her own quiet future on her own terms, Clara agreed. The wedding took place exactly 3 days later, in a cold, empty registry office. There was no romance, no celebration, only the scratching of expensive fountain pens on thick legal documents. As they stepped out of the building and into the blinding flash of waiting paparazzi cameras, Alistair tried to drape a breathtakingly expensive diamond necklace around her neck to complete the wealthy illusion. Clara caught his wrist in mid-air, her grip surprisingly firm. She gently but resolutely removed the heavy diamonds from his hands, passing them back to him. Looking into his bewildered eyes, she told him that she would play the part of his wife for the cameras, but she would never become one of his purchased possessions. Alistair stood frozen, watching her walk toward the waiting town car with her head held high, wearing a simple, unbranded dress that suddenly looked more elegant than couture. For the very first time in his calculated life, the powerful billionaire realized he had absolutely no control over the situation. And as Julian Mercer watched the newlyweds from a distance, narrowing his eyes with dark suspicion and bitter envy, the true, dangerous game began. The transition into Alistair's sprawling penthouse was a clash of two entirely different universes. Clara refused the services of his private chef, choosing instead to make her own simple meals in the cavernous, underused kitchen. At first, Alistair watched her from the shadows of the hallway, baffled by her stubborn independence. He tried to hire her a personal assistant and offer her unlimited credit cards, but she defiantly rejected them, telling him that her compliance in public did not mean he could buy her compliance in private. But soon, the late hours of the night brought them together over steaming mugs of cheap coffee that Clara insisted on brewing herself. They would sit in the dim light of the kitchen island, debating everything from corporate ethics to the noise of the city streets below. The tension between them slowly shifted from a battle of stubborn wills to a dangerous, crackling attraction. Their fragile truce deepened the night Clara fell ill, her body finally giving in to the sheer exhaustion of her previous life and the immense stress of her new one. When Alistair found her shivering on the living room sofa, he did not call his team of elite concierge doctors to deal with the problem. Instead, he abruptly cancelled a critical strategy dinner with Julian Mercer. For the entire evening, the billionaire chief executive sat quietly by her side, gently pressing damp cloths to her forehead and ensuring she drank warm tea. It was a silent, tender gesture of genuine care that stripped away his arrogant facade. Clara looked at him through heavy eyelids in the quiet dark, realizing for the first time that the ruthless businessman possessed a fiercely protective, vulnerable heart. But that comfortable, quiet illusion shattered into pieces during a high-stakes charity gala later that week. Julian Mercer, determined to prove Clara was nothing but uneducated trash who would ruin the company's image, cornered her in front of the key foreign investors. He began questioning her aggressively about complex offshore tax structures, expecting her to freeze and humiliate Alistair. Instead, Clara refused to cower. Her eyes flashed with a fierce aristocratic pride. She dismantled Julian's aggressive argument flawlessly, using highly specific financial terminology and citing obscure international banking laws. The conservative investors were deeply impressed, raising their glasses to Alistair for marrying such a brilliant woman. But Alistair was paralyzed. He recognized the highly specialized corporate strategy she had just described. It was a signature tactic that belonged to only one disgraced corporate dynasty. The ride back to the penthouse was suffocatingly quiet. The moment the heavy doors closed behind them, Alistair demanded the truth. He paced the living room, his voice dangerously low, demanding to know how a supposedly uneducated cleaning lady understood the exact financial blueprints of a collapsed empire. The air grew heavy with raw pain as Clara finally broke. She confessed that her real name was Clara Sterling, the vanished sole heiress of the notorious Sterling capital empire. Her family had been destroyed by their own catastrophic greed and a massive corruption scandal that had ruined thousands of innocent lives. Tears of ancient grief and shame filled her eyes as she explained that she had faked her disappearance and walked away from billions, choosing to scrub floors in anonymity rather than live on stolen, dirty money. This agonizing confrontation hurt far more than any lie, as the heavy burden of her past finally spilled over the pristine marble floors of his home. Alistair felt a profound, stinging betrayal. His entire life was built on calculated control and absolute transparency in his contracts, and the one person he thought he had figured out had deceived him completely. He withdrew, punishing her with a cold, agonizing silence that echoed through the massive penthouse. They lived like ghosts passing in the hallways, never speaking a word. Yet underneath his injured pride, Alistair found he could not actually let her go. He began leaving a single, simple daisy on the kitchen counter before he left for work every morning, a quiet memory of a passing comment she had made weeks ago about preferring resilient weeds to expensive, fragile orchids. It was his silent plea for a connection, an acknowledgement that he saw the strength it took for her to survive. While they struggled to bridge the painful, quiet divide between them, a much darker storm was gathering at the Vance Global headquarters. Julian Mercer had not missed the slip of Clara's tongue at the gala, driven by bitter ambition and a desperate desire for absolute power, Julian hired a team of ruthless private investigators to dig into the shadows of Clara's past. When the explosive dossier detailing her true identity landed on his heavy desk, Julian smiled a cold, victorious smile. He finally had the weapon he needed to destroy his partner. Julian began secretly contacting the foreign investors one by one, arranging a surprise boardroom ambush. He planned to expose Clara's scandalous criminal lineage to the world, shatter the impending merger, and force the board of directors to strip Alistair of his own company. The trap was perfectly set, and Alistair and Clara were walking blindly toward the execution. The morning of the final merger vote, the boardroom was filled with the heavy, expectant silence of international investors. Alistair stood at the head of the long mahogany table, ready to finalize the deal, when Julian Mercer slammed a thick stack of manila folders onto the polished wood. With a triumphant sneer, Julian slid a dossier to every investor in the room. He loudly declared that Alistair had brought a fraud into their ranks, exposing Clara as the disgraced runaway heiress of the collapsed sterling capital empire. The room erupted into shocked whispers as the conservative board members flipped through the explosive documents. Julian demanded that Alistair step down immediately, claiming the scandal would destroy Vance Global if the media caught wind of it. Clara, sitting quietly by the window, did not shrink under the sudden, glaring weight of their judgmental stares. She stood up, her posture radiating the very aristocratic grace she had tried so hard to hide. She looked directly at the investors and calmly acknowledged her lineage, stating that while she shared the sterling blood, she had willingly walked away from billions of dollars because she refused to profit from corruption. Alistair walked around the table and stood firmly by her side, lacing his fingers through hers in front of the entire room. He told the board that Clara possessed more integrity in her bare feet than anyone else sitting in the corporate towers of the city. Then Alistair pulled a single slim folder from his jacket and tossed it onto the center of the table. He announced that while Julian had been obsessed with digging up ghosts from Clara's past, Alistair had ordered an audit of Julian's present. The new document revealed a massive, undeniable trail of embezzlement, showing Julian had been secretly siphoning company funds into private offshore accounts for years. The atmosphere in the room shifted violently. The investors threw Julian's dossiers aside, disgusted by the undeniable proof of his immediate betrayal. Julian's triumphant smile vanished, replaced by pale, stammering panic as he looked around for support. There was none. The board unanimously voted to terminate him on the spot, and security was called to escort the humiliated partner out of the building. By the end of the day, the news of Julian's fraud hit the financial media, and his reputation was permanently destroyed, leaving him entirely abandoned by the elite circles he had worshipped. When the chaos finally settled and the enormous office emptied, Alistair and Clara were left standing alone in the quiet glow of the evening skyline. Alistair turned to her, his voice stripped of all its usual corporate armor. He apologized for his coldness, admitting that his wounded pride had blinded him to the immense courage it took for her to survive her past. He tore the original marriage contract perfectly in half, letting the heavy paper fall to the floor. Looking deep into her eyes, he asked her to stay, not as a hired wife or a corporate shield, but as his true equal. Clara reached out, her hand gently resting on his chest. She whispered that she was entirely done running from who she was, and that she wanted to build a real future with the man who had learned to see the woman beneath the uniform. The seasons turned, and the cold, transactional nature of their beginning faded into a warm, unbreakable partnership. A year later, Clara did not return to scrubbing floors, nor did she fade into the background as a quiet billionaire wife. With Alistair proudly watching from the front row, she cut the ribbon on her very own firm, an ethical financial consultancy dedicated to protecting vulnerable businesses from the exact predatory tactics her family had once used. They had taken the broken pieces of their pasts and forged a brilliant, unshakable future together. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story of love and redemption. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next stories. We will see you next time.
Editor. The infographic presents the story of Alistair Vance and Clara Thorne is more than a romance between a billionaire and a cleaning worker. It reveals a deeper journey involving power, identity, social prejudice, emotional vulnerability, corruption, and redemption. At the beginning, Alistair believes that every problem can be solved through control, money, and carefully written contracts. His need for a respectable wife is not motivated by love, but by pressure from investors and his determination to protect a major corporate merger. Clara enters his world barefoot and soaked from a broken sprinkler, yet she immediately proves that dignity and intelligence have nothing to do with clothing, status, or profession. By saving the merger documents and identifying a financial error that wealthy executives failed to notice, she challenges the assumptions of everyone in the room. The infographic highlights the contrast between Alistair, Clara, and Julian Mercer. Alistair represents control and emotional isolation. He has built his life around reputation, discipline, and predictable agreements because genuine relationships require a vulnerability that frightens him. Clara represents self-respect, resilience, and moral independence. Although she appears powerless because she works as a cleaner, she refuses expensive gifts, rejects attempts to control her, and insists on being treated as an equal. Julian represents the destructive side of ambition. His insecurity and obsession with status gradually transform into jealousy, manipulation, and financial corruption. Their marriage begins as a transaction, but the relationship arc shows how it slowly develops through respect, care, conflict, truth, and partnership. Clara's refusal to become a purchased possession forces Alistair to reconsider the way he treats people. Their conversations, disagreements, and quiet moments together begin to break through his emotional defenses. When he cares for her during her illness, he acts without expecting profit or public recognition. This moment demonstrates that love becomes possible when control is replaced by sincere concern. Clara's hidden identity adds another psychological dimension. Her decision to abandon the sterling fortune was an attempt to escape the shame created by her family's corruption. By becoming invisible, she believed she could separate herself from their crimes. However, hiding her past also meant hiding part of herself. Her confession shows how trauma can cause people to reject their own identity, even when they were not personally responsible for the wrongdoing that harmed them. The social themes in the infographic emphasize class prejudice, gender expectations, and invisible labor. Clara is initially judged by her uniform and occupation, while the wealthy executives are automatically treated as competent and important. The story reverses this hierarchy by making the cleaning worker the most observant, ethical, and financially knowledgeable person in the room. It also challenges the expectation that women in powerful environments should remain decorative, agreeable, and silent. Clara earns respect because she speaks honestly and refuses to perform obedience. The bare feet symbolize humility and authenticity because Clara enters the corporate world without the protective appearance of wealth. The daisy represents resilience and emotional reconciliation, showing that something simple can survive where fragile luxury cannot. The torn marriage contract represents the end of a relationship based on obligation and the beginning of one based on equality and choice. In the final confrontation, Alistair proves his transformation by standing beside Clara publicly and exposing Julian's crimes. Clara also completes her redemption by using her knowledge to create an ethical financial consultancy. Together, they demonstrate that integrity is more valuable than status, that people are greater than their past, and that real redemption requires truth, courage, accountability, and action.